Hello, hello, hello.
Hello. I've never done this before. I type, but I don't talk.
That's fine, though.
We have to just kind of pretend that we know what we're doing. Who's giggling in the background?
People go, oh, should we really be talking about this? Are we supposed to be? Oh, looks like you're going to anyway.
Welcome to the Pros Community Choice Award-winning Troublesome Terps, the interpreting equivalent of a glass of cold water on a hot day. It's episode 17, and today we're living up to our goal of talking about the things that keep interpreters up at night. But before we even get there, it's time to welcome back our regular Teutonic duo. Here today, once again, is Brussels' answer to the question, just how cool are interpreter podcasters? Welcome back to the show, Alexander Drexel.
Oh, God, thank you so much, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be here.
And here once again for another round is our very own Bavarian sensation, Alexander Gansmeyer.
Hey guys, coming to you live from Munich where Oktoberfest is going on. I'm actually breaking in my lederhosen as we speak, so if you hear me squeezing and trying to, get out some sort of sound, it's because it's still very, very tight.
All the juicy details.
I was going to say that one image makes me really glad of today's topic on the show because I'm going to need a specialist in mental health after that image.
Yes.
Just wait till I send you the pictures from tomorrow.
Oh, please let's not. Today's show marks a milestone for us. There's no more important issue in our profession today than making sure that we still have professionals tomorrow. So today we're going to talk about the biggest and arguably most difficult challenge faced by our profession as a whole, and you heard that a moment ago, mental health. And to do that, we have the honour of welcoming a mental health expert to the show, Justine Mason. Justine's a senior lecturer in health and social care at a university in Wrexham that I will not attempt to pronounce, and was a mental health nurse before that. But I think it'd be really interesting to hear straight out how someone with a background in mental health and teaching mental health nurses came to be interested in interpreting. But before we get to that, Justine, welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you for having me. This is so much fun.
So could you tell us a bit about, because your background is in mental health nursing and very much in healthcare, what first attracted you to talking about and thinking about mental health amongst interpreters?
Working with interpreters. I used to work on acute psychiatric units, and you get people who are experiencing kind of acute mental distress, psychosis, and they need interpreters. And it kind of occurred to me that as a nurse, I had all sorts of means of dealing with the stories that I was hearing from people, but the interpreters didn't. They just we signed their form and off they went. So when I started to do my master's in translation studies, I picked up a research interest in interpreters in mental health settings, which then became interpreters on mental health.
And when you say that nurses have means to deal with mental stress, with issues, what are those means? Can you give us a flavour of that?
I mean, our kind of learning our resilience really starts right in the first early days of our training, because we have, from when you first sort of step on wards and start having patient contact, you have a mentor, you have a more experienced nurse who will talk you through it. We have it's actually resilience and emotional literacy is actually addressed specifically as part of the training curriculum. So it's always something you're always thinking about, and you develop that resilience over time.
And I think that's one thing that really strikes me, because there was a well-known study by AIC, which is the International Association of Conference Interpreters, and to many interpreters, AIC represents the kind of upper echelons of interpreting as a whole. And yet they did a study in 2001 which showed that interpreters had some of the highest levels of emotional stress and burnout in that kind of interpreting than they had seen in any of the professions that had been tested. I think they tested with a higher stress than higher levels of burnout than teachers and army officers. And it strikes me that if that's what's happening in conference interpreting, where the conditions are good, you have, air-conditioned booths, you have set conditions, and you're supposedly taught professional distance, then the rate of burnout and the lack of resilience in other forms of interpreting that don't have those same security blankets, if you like, must be almost orders of magnitude higher. If that's what's happening at the top of the at the best paid, best treated end of the profession, it really leaves open the big question of what's happening elsewhere in interpreting, where there isn't as much protection as there is amongst members of a big association like AIC.
Yeah, I mean, the research supports that as well. There's a 20-year body of research that shows that going into the sort of, I guess it's the areas of society that we don't want to think about. You're talking about courts, prisons, immigration centres, psychiatric hospitals. They're places we don't want to think of as existing. So the interpreter kind of becomes hidden away from that. But I mean, I suppose the other advantage conference interpreters have is that they have other interpreters around them. You think about the amount of public service interpreters who work freelance, who kind of come in, do their thing, and there's a whole load of kind of literature in that says that health services should debrief the interpreter, which is all right if you're doing sort of a one-to-one psychology session, but if you're interpreting for something like somebody being what they call sectioned under the Mental Health Act, that's a process that can take 6 or 7 hours from start to finish and involve multiple agencies. So in that kind of huge process, who has the debriefing kind of responsibility? Because everybody has their own sort of professional things to do as well. The interpreter kind of gets forgotten, and they don't have other interpreters around them generally.
I think that phrase, the interpreter gets forgotten, is kind of resonates a lot with me, because even when because a lot of conference interpreters are freelance as well, but we have the advantage of we're sharing a booth. Yeah. And in not all, but in a large percentage of cases, we will walk into a job, do the job, and go home. And that job could be anything from, my most recent job was a fairly straightforward job on social policy, which most interpreters will say, that's not that difficult. But there have been jobs. I remember one job where in the middle of an international summit, we handled a plenary talk by a speaker who was talking about life in occupied Palestine and how he learned to love Israeli soldiers. And there's no way that was not going to be emotional. And, it lands on your desk, you have to deal with it. And the reality is, in a conference session, you get a half an hour plenary, and the expectation is that you'll be okay half an hour, 20 minutes later to do the next session. Even if you've just landed. I mean, we literally went from singing cartoon pandas to how I learned to love Israeli soldiers.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm sure kind of maybe the two Alexes will have had similar situations where you go from extremely emotional material to bread and butter or to just crazy stuff. And there's the expectation, I don't know if clients even think, oh, hold on a minute, that might have had an effect on the interpreter, should we do something? A lot of the time, unless you have a good relationship and it's a repeat client, a lot of the time you realise that you're on your own and you just have to deal with it.
And I was going to say, I think certainly from that kind of point of view, part of the problem is that you encourage the interpreter to be, or the interpreter is encouraged to be invisible. So you almost kind of start from a baseline of you're not relevant, you don't matter. Maybe I'm overthinking it.
Well, that's generally speaking an issue that we struggle with.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to share is just a little episode, something that happened to me after what Jonathan just said, because I found myself in a conference, and I don't remember quite remember what it was about, but there was a mother there sharing the story of how she lost her daughter, and I believe it was to drugs, and it kind of came out of the blue and kind of hit me as well. So it's interesting that sometimes you really just confronted with that without any preparation, and then well, you just do your best, I guess. I don't know, Alex, if you ever had anything like that happen to you in a conference context or somewhere else.
Well, in a conference context, no. I was trying to think and come up with stuff, and the only thing that I can come up with is sort of like gruesome medical conferences, but that's not kind of the same thing. That's kind of stressful on a different level, but not really, I think, in the same context. But yeah, in a conference setting so far, I haven't really experienced anything like that. Now, of course, in public service settings, it's different. But I only used to do that when I was living in the UK, so I might be able to share a story or two in a roundabout way when we get to that. But yeah, in a conference so far,
but maybe this would be a good moment to just take a step back, because Justine, I would be interested in how all that happened. I mean, you said, and Jonathan also said in the introduction, that you started out as a nurse, and that you apparently worked with interpreters. But I mean, how did that happen for you, that you became more involved with interpreting, developed that research interest? Can you just tell us that story of how that happened?
The actual honest story is not quite that noble. I was doing my translation masters, and I'd had this idea. We had to present our master's proposal to like the whole kind of school. So that was, the great and the good, and all these people with letters before their name and professors and stuff. And I decided I was going to do this whole thing about, translation as transference and all the rest of it. And there was only like one thing that had been written on it. So I ordered this through the library. It was just before Christmas, and it was about 3 days before, and it hadn't come. And I thought, I cannot turn up with nothing. I can't. That's not an option. I need to find something that, one, I can do quickly, and two, they're not going to ask me any questions about. And one thing I do know is when you tell people sort of, service user stories and that, people tend not to ask too many questions. So that was kind of how I did it. And it was almost by accident that what I discovered was, at that point, which is about 7 years ago, it was a hugely under-researched area. So off I went. And because I had an interest in languages, I'd worked with interpreters, I'd worked in mental health settings. It was just it just all kind of came together.
And I think, what you said about the interpreter being invisible, that's for I was over the moon to hear you say that, because some of us have been rattling on about interpreter visibility since our first book came out. But there's something about when people start looking at interpreter mental health, and when people start thinking about the people side of our profession, one thing that comes up a lot in the research, and I'm sure you'll have seen this, is this idea of the language side of interpreting is kind of already well known. And it's quite a brave decision for someone like you to take the risk of going into, a fairly new field and waving the flag and saying, we know all about this transference equivalence stuff, but actually there's a whole interaction going on that people aren't really listening to. And we've had people try to look at, the linguistics of the interaction and the roles. But it seems to be that what you've uncovered is, no, this is more than information being passed. This is people dealing with content that under ordinary circumstances is stressful. Now they're dealing with it in two languages without the training to deal with that. And did you find that when you started asking that question, how did you find interpreters reacting to that? Were they positive about it, or were they a little bit iffy about someone coming onto their turf and asking personal questions?
No. It's been really, really well received. People tend to just be really glad that somebody is interested. It's like, this is what we've been trying to say, and nobody will listen. And I remember going to a thing, standing up and going, look, I'm really sorry, I'm here. I'm a bit of kind of a fraud because I'm not actually an interpreter. I'm a nurse. Because I'd sat there and I'd gone because it was something about interpreting mental health. And somebody was sitting there going, get a hobby. Get a hobby. You think get a hobby is going to cover? No, mate, dude, that's not even going to begin to cover it. And I couldn't kind of sit down and just shut up. So,
but well, I was just thinking about because Alex Drexel and I met Justine first at the ITI conference, where anyone who mentions Billy Connolly in front of a Scot automatically gets an audience. But how did you feel?
What I thought was like looks of disappointment. Just like, so you're not going to talk about Billy Connolly? Nah, not even close. Just to get me in.
But it was fascinating to watch interpreters become skilled people watchers. But it was fascinating to listen to that audience as you started talking about interpreter mental health. Did you get any feedback afterwards that made you think, there's something more to be done here? What was the reaction, especially at ITI conference, to someone being so bold about this is a problem, here's how to fix it?
I think there's always that kind of bit when people go, oh, should we really be talking about this? Are we supposed to be? Oh, looks like you're going to anyway.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, it's not my regulatory body. I've got, nothing to lose. But it seems like a conversation that needs to be had. And,
yeah.
Because it's people's mental health.
And this is a difficulty because ITI is a professional association, and there is a regulatory body for public service interpreting, and it's difficult for anyone in that situation to quickly pick up the ball and run with it. And it's funny. I remember I decided to share at a conference a couple of years ago. I decided to, as a complete non-expert, and the only expertise I had was I went through a minor burnout episode for a week, and I just shared that experience with people, and then talked about the need for a supportive community. And I was shocked at how many people came up to me afterwards and said, "You mean it's okay to be honest?"
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And it says everything about our profession. And I have had people ask, is it not breaching client confidentiality to get support? Now, could you give us your view on how we get support without breaching confidentiality? Because that's a big issue that interpreters have asked me about.
Partly need to stop overthinking the confidentiality thing. If you have a colleague that that you trust, and you kind of sit there and go, look, this has to stay between the two of us. I mean, short of giving them the company name, the client's name and address, you can talk about it without giving the details away. You know what I mean? Confidentiality is giving somebody's name, address, clinical details. You don't have to say where you were. You don't have to say who it was in terms of a name, but you do need to say it, because otherwise it just goes around in your head, and then it spirals off onto all sorts of pathways.
I agree. I think the whole I don't want to say the magic bullet, but I think it's about decompressing to another colleague, and I think those are really the only people who, if they've been in that situation, really know what you're going through if you have one of those situations. So I completely agree with you.
I think, I have come across colleagues of various ages who have told me, doesn't confidentiality mean that we can't tell anyone anything?
No.
And and this is where trying to help people understand. I actually wrote an article once and pulled out the BMA's definition of confidentiality, trying to get people to understand that we're probably doing ourselves more harm than good by battening down the hatches. There's also professional pressure. I don't know if the other two have noticed that. I've noticed professional pressure where if you're doing well and someone asks how are things, it's totally fine. but I have felt it, and I know other interpreters have said to me that they felt it, that if someone says how are things, it's very difficult as an interpreter to say, you know what, I haven't had any work in X number of months, or you know what, I've just had a something or other. It seems very difficult in our profession for interpreters to open up to other interpreters and say, you know what, you've asked me how I am, the actual answer is pretty rubbish. I'm not sure where that's come from, but certainly I've been aware of it, and I've talked to colleagues, and I've heard other colleagues say the same thing. I don't know if the two Alexes, maybe it's different in the when you're all staff, Alex. Is it when you're all staff, are you all completely open and transparent with each other?
No, I don't think that it's different for us. But I was thinking of something else. A very simple thing is that it's already very difficult to talk with colleagues about things that maybe went wrong, mistakes that were made, or when somebody screwed up, and that's already very difficult to talk about. So of course it's even more complicated and more of a thorny issue when you're talking about things, like mental health or problems that you have in your private life that of course will affect your performance in the booth, that kind of stuff. No, I don't think there's a difference with us, compared to other interpreters.
But I also think in Jonathan's case, this reminded me so much. This is just kind of a sideline thing, but it's a very British problem to have, because when I was still living in the UK and somebody asked me, "Oh, how are you?" and I was like, "Well, not really good." Like their face would just drop. Yeah, like in the beginning we did that because we were new to the whole thing, and their faces would just drop. So I think the level of the issue might be different in the UK, but that's just on a side note. But I do think that I don't know. Maybe the German. Well, we do have a reputation for being very blunt, but I think in Germany, at least in the English booth, in the area where I work, is quite open. So if you say, "So how are you?" you can go into a situation like you wouldn't say, "Oh my God, I'm so bad, I'm so depressed. Like this whole interpreting thing isn't working out." But you could talk about the fact that you're stressed out because the season's not going so well, and then you can go into that discussion. And I think that's fair game. There's only a few people that I would really tell like about personal stuff. If something went wrong with my family, like I wouldn't normally bring that into the booth, but I do have some friends that I work with on a regular basis. But I would simply talk to them on the phone too. Like I would call them because we're actually friends. So I think in that instance, it's different again.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing because I don't know if it's a business person thing. You talk about it being a British thing. There are friends that I have in church that I can just turn around to and say, "This is rubbish." But it's easier because they're out of the profession. And obviously when you're married to someone as well. But when you have someone who's completely out of the profession and you're not half thinking about, are they going to recommend me for a job if they know X? There's this reputation factor in interpreting that I've noticed is interesting. And I remember it was actually in a conference in Warsaw when I first shared the burnout story, and you could almost see the front row was quite experienced people. You could almost see them collectively drawing breath going, "He's doing what?" And it's trying to build that level, that get to the stage in the profession where it's okay if someone decides, I'm doing a talk on supporting each other, and I'm going to make it real by saying, here's why we need support, because if you don't have support, this happens. But most of the conferences I've been to at the moment are either certain agencies and clients are star cross, words that we wouldn't say on the podcast, or it's about how great are we here, try to get our skills better. There are very few spaces that we've created that say, actually, let's talk about the stuff that's going to wreck your career if you don't deal with it. It's very, very rare to hear that anywhere.
One of the things you kind of miss it, when you talk about skills, but surely actually having the kind of emotional literacy to engage very, very quickly with somebody who might be in a medical or psychological distress, that's a skill. Yeah. And that's a particular interpreting skill, is engage to get the trust. To disengage fairly quickly, because once that assignment's over, the chances are you're gone.
Yeah.
So that is a skill in itself, and that's, to be able to do that, you have to know yourself. You have to be aware of what impacts on you and what doesn't. So I think it's probably important to put that as part of an interpreter skill set.
Yeah.
Can we just stick with that for a second, because I find that very interesting. Now, it's a bit of a running gag, I suppose, among interpreters, at least here in the institutions, is that if you ask an interpreter, what did you do last week or even yesterday, very often they won't know, or they have to think for a few minutes before they remember. True. Because if you do a lot of work, if you do a lot of steady and regular work, then it all just blends together. And I think then at some point you will just develop, I guess, a mechanism or a reflex where you just forget these things. And of course, most of the topics are very bland or just, standard topics and nothing that's sort of emotionally disturbing or anything like that. So I'm not sure what I'm trying to say, but is that maybe helpful? Or is it maybe for some jobs it's just not possible to simply forget? I don't know if I'm making sense, but I was just thinking about that.
I think that's a mechanism, but it does make me wonder how useful forgetting without dealing with something is. If you're doing a lot of bland kind of policy stuff, it's no big deal. But you chat to any interpreter, and everyone's got a story of nightmare client. Everyone's got a story of job that they're really proud of. There are some things that I've done that, I can tell you one specific one. I was doing research at a Christian conference once, and my research had finished, and they asked, "Can you jump into the booth to relieve the two interpreters who are exhausted?" And I thought, no problem at all. And it just so happened that I think it was the second shift I did was when they were raising money for some of the work they were doing abroad, and they were raising money to basically create economic activity in an area where the only existing economic activity was selling women and girls into prostitution. Now, I'm a trained interpreter, and I had quote unquote all of the skills, and I do fairly regular work. But that job, the only mechanism that I had and the only mechanism I was trained to do was almost to switch off to the emotional content of it. But the strange thing is because I had blocked it while I was interpreting to be able to interpret, I went out for, I think it was dinner with my wife afterwards, and suddenly as we sat down at the table, I said something like, "Did I just say," and then gave, a brief outline and said yes. And at that moment it hit me and I couldn't eat. Yeah. And it makes me wonder whether, yes, if we're doing regular work, we'll tend to forget, but if there has been something that's made a difference, maybe Justine, you'll correct me on this, but if something has had an emotional effect, forgetting doesn't seem to necessarily wash away the effect it has unless it's been dealt with in some way.
Yeah, I mean, it's a strategy that worked for nobody ever. Because it doesn't go away. It stays there. And, you're right, if you don't deal with it, it might not impact you there and then. It might impact you a week, a month, 3 months down the line. But it will come back. It ain't going anywhere.
Wow.
Did you, in the framework of your research, because you talked about emotional literacy, which I think is a great concept, and I think one would think that professionally trained interpreters are supposedly very good when it comes to empathy, but does that at all translate into emotional literacy? Did you find anything like that in your research?
Yeah, people who have good emotional literacy, tend to work the other way around. People who have good emotional literacy have better empathy, because there's a whole kind of continuum of empathy, and which starts at sympathy and kind of goes into this, because sympathy is kind of not understanding what somebody feels, but feeling what they feel. And that in a professional context is not helpful. If you can understand how somebody feels and use that understanding to help them without taking it on board, that's the more emotionally literate way of doing it. the thing is, you kind of assume, you talk a lot about kind of interpreter training, and it's that sort of functional skills, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you ever get taught empathy? How to empathize, how to contain that empathy, how to manage it, how to approach it with an emotional intelligence? Because it's something you assume everybody can do. But I'm not sure it's something you automatically can do because you speak another language.
I certainly know as part of my training there was this idea reflected in theory as much as practice that you need to try and get into the speaker's head. Now, I mean that I actually wrote about that in my thesis, and I've got a paper coming out about now, which has that in the background. That interpreters are classically told you need to get into the person's head. Now, the difficulty with that, as you've just said, is that it's fine getting into the head of a...
It assumes that you know what to do when you get there.
Yes, and I think also there's an assumption that that is a safe space to be. And if you're doing, the fishing policy off the northwest coast of Scotland, then that's probably a safe place to be. If, on the other hand, you're doing interpreting for a wife beater or a murderer, that's not a safe place to be. And I wasn't trained in public service interpreting, but I've not come across anyone kind of saying there's a line that there are some people's heads you do not want to be in. I've never heard anyone in interpreting say that. Maybe the Alexes have had a different background to me.
Yeah, I didn't quite catch the question in there. Sorry.
Yeah, the question was, had anyone ever, we're often taught to get into people's heads.
Yeah.
Has anyone ever told you sometimes that's not a safe place to be, so don't?
Oh, I guess, yeah, that's probably, I don't know. I'm just trying to think back to my training. I don't know if that ever came up. Our training was very hands-on, very sort of practical or sort of focused on the interpreting methods and stuff like that. So probably not, no.
We had a semblance of that in our education. We did for kind of business interpreting situations. So, doctor-patient discussions, those kinds of situations. We did talk about how to, quote unquote, empathize with the patient, how to be respectful in a situation, but still be at a distance in a way. And hats off to our teachers back then at university, because they were really dramatic. They were really going for trying to put us through the ringer. But that's really it. Those were isolated instances, and we never really had that talk where somebody said, you have to be careful to not be in someone else's head. It might not be a good idea. But I think, I don't know. Doesn't self-preservation kick in at some point? If you're sitting there, I had this one. I actually had 3 different public service interpreting assignments in my life, and I don't think I'll ever forget them. Not necessarily because of the people, but not necessarily not because of the people. It was just, just everything came together. One thing was in prison, one thing was in another prison, and one thing was in court. So I probably remember it just for those reasons. But the first thing that I did was with a pedophile, and it was about the fact that he had intended to... Oh, sorry, actually, it was 4 public service interpreting assignments. One was at a mental ward. That was actually probably the I don't know if draining is the right word. Well, it was definitely the most interesting one, just because the lady was a schizophrenic and she had paranoid anxiety attacks. And so the thing is, for us, it's usually about translating the words and, interpreting back and forth from one language to the other. But she wasn't making any sense. She was just mumbling along just because, she had a panic attack. She didn't know where she was. She was in the UK. She was supposed to be in Germany. And they were asking me, well, what is she saying? What is she saying? And then I had to explain to them that she's, not really saying much, and kind of explain like what she's doing, but that she's not answering their questions, because they had asked her a question and then she just started kind of like curling up and doing her thing. And they were like, why aren't you telling us what she's saying? And I'm like, well, she's not really giving you an answer. Wow. And then I had to explain that. So that was quite intense. But I think going back to my point with the self-preservation, when I went to prison and interpreted for that pedophile, like it had never crossed my mind at all to kind of like put myself in the shoes of the speaker, because in that way I could deliver a more accurate interpreting. Like that never crossed my mind, and I don't think anyone would argue that you should. Even for quality's sake, like nobody. If anybody were to make that point, I would have to have a serious word with them.
Yeah, because that's the problem, right? I mean, I'm not too familiar with all the strategies that exist for self-preservation, I guess, but one that came to my mind immediately was to just go out of the situation. But if you're there as an interpreter, that's not really an option.
And also we were locked in.
Yeah. And I think this is the thing, is that there's... My experience has been on the occasions where I've had emotional content. I mean, there was one where I just had to mentally step back as pure survival. But there have been times when so for instance, that film director one, the situation there was that you didn't see what was coming. You just had this really interesting, really deep story that you wanted to connect with. And then came the hard bit, and I think that makes. I guess if the ideal would be that you're briefed for it and that you see it coming, and that you have strategies. But the difficulty is that there are situations where you're doing a summit. Oh, and here's a guy with an interesting talk who seems to be more interesting than your average politician. Hold on a minute, where's he taking me? Does that ever happen in your profession, Justine, where something that looks routine turns out to be, hold on a minute, this isn't as routine as it looked? Does that make it harder to deal with sometimes, or are you trained, are you told there's no such thing as a routine situation, Justine?
I mean, generally there is no such thing as a routine situation, and you kind of learn to anticipate the unexpected. But there's also that kind of, you're right, you deal with the situation that you've got at the point that you've got it. And it's afterwards, once it's over, everything's calmed down, you kind of go, oh man, I did not see that coming. Bad times. But you've got other people around you who've been in that situation at that time with you. And, you might not even do anything particular. You might just go, should we just have a brew? Yeah, let's have a brew. And just sit, 3 or 4 of you, just in silence. But yeah, in the immediate, your self-preservation kicks in, but you deal with it at some point afterwards.
And is it okay that not every situation seems to need, going and finding a therapist style thing? Is it accepted that some difficult situations, all we need to do is just, go and find somewhere to cry, or go and have a cup of tea or something like that, without necessarily thinking, I need to go and see someone specific about this?
Yeah, absolutely. And half of the skill is kind of accepting how you feel. Rather than doing this, what seems to be quite a totally British thing, to go, I'm fine.
Yeah.
You go back to, how are you? Well, I'm fine. Your leg's dropping off, I've got leprosy and everybody's dead, but no, I'm fine, soldier on.
That's how we built the empire.
Yeah,
I guess. There's another thing that just occurred to me, because we've talked mainly about how the content of interpreting can be stressful or mentally taxing, but what about things like a precarious situation, low pay, customers not wanting to pay at all, the whole shenanigans that went on in the UK with the outsourcing of public service interpreting? I suppose that can also cause mental stress.
Yeah, I mean, those are equal. They're longer term kind of constant stresses that start grinding you down. And that certainly, has an impact on your mood, on your mental health. Because there's a physiological thing, because it's a lot of kind of cortisol and adrenaline in your body, and it impacts on you physically as well as mentally then.
And one of the things I've noticed that's almost ironic about when you're struggling is that the very motivation and push that you need to do the things to get you out of the pit you're in are the very things your brain doesn't seem equipped to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Certainly I've found that at times when business has been at its worst, and what I actually need to do is go out the house and go networking, because things are at their worst. You feel like you're not able to do it, and you get helpful people saying, well, if you go for a walk you'll feel better. It's like, no, if I slap you in the face I'll feel better. But there is this idea of I often wonder how much are people right when they say, there's no such thing as motivation, you just have to do it even if you don't feel like it, and how much is it just accepting that at this very moment I'm not ready, but I'm going to get myself ready because I know that what I need to do is this. It's finding the place somewhere between, no, I'm not going to sit here all day in my rocking chair and just let things go even further downhill, but by the same token, right now maybe a cup of tea is better than writing a social media marketing plan. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because the chances are, if you do that social media marketing plan in that frame of mind, you're going to then look at it and go, oh man, this is pants. and then
probably,
then you're just adding to it because you go, I can't even do that anymore.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, I can't go science, I can't get business, and now I can't even do a plan. And whereas if you'd given it half an hour, had a brew, a couple of custard creams, then you'd have been all right.
That's a really good
kind
point.
of specialist. Tea and custard cream solve most things.
Pretty much.
But Justine, what I'd be interested in, I mean, you've been in this field for a while now. Do you see things changing, hopefully for the better, in wider society when it comes to topics like depression, mental health? Is there a sort of a wider acceptance that depression is more than just being sad or down? Or is there wide acceptance in society that this is actually a thing that needs to be addressed and that people need help?
I think we do it all wrong, really. Major soapbox alert.
Go on then.
Because we kind of,
for it.
Part of the problem is when people do have depression, that we give them tablets, and that kind of goes, there's something wrong with you. You have a problem, you have a disorder, which is different from normality, our normal order. And we're looking now, going, oh my God, there's so many sort of kids and adolescents with all these mental health problems. And there's something ridiculous, like a 70% increase in the last 25 years of young people with anxiety and depression. But at no point do we kind of go, okay, what are we doing wrong? What is it in society that's actually putting this pressure on people? Because it can't be some kind of weird evolutionary thing, which would make it a disease. It has to be something in society. So I think we're using the words a lot more, but we're not kind of catching up as much as we should with actually stopping things happening in the first place. Because you never get celebrities talking about it once they've been through it. I was depressed. I had mental health problems. At no point when they have them do they say it. So it's okay to have recovered from them. But I'm not sure we're great at, when people are ill, dealing with it.
Which I think comes back to what you're talking about, the whole interpreter invisibility and building the strategies in, and that, this podcast will hopefully help people talk about it. But the bigger question is, well, what's causing it in the first place? And some of it could be vicarious trauma. An argument that I've been having, and I know I've been making people uncomfortable, is actually a lot of our mental health problems as a profession, definitely not as individuals, but as a profession, a lot of the mental health issues seem to me to be self-inflicted, in that we've created systems that are no good for us. Like our complete misunderstanding of confidentiality. We've created systems that are causing problems, and we can't just kind of wring our hands and go, no, we've got a mental health issue, without looking at the systems that we've set up and saying, are these the right systems for keeping interpreters mentally healthy?
Yeah, no, they're not.
Thank you.
That's it. That's my time done. I'm gone. So, well, no, because you start from this point of trying to make the and that's not you three. That's generally from being not human.
Yeah.
So when you set it up as a purely linguistic thing, you're kind of going, we're putting a human being, but we don't want you to have any human reactions. And then when people are kind of going, but we're humans, we have emotions. No, you're an interpreter. You're not meant to, so don't.
Yeah.
Your code of conduct says don't, so don't.
Yeah.
And, I can just see people going, oh, well, when you put it like that, yeah, no, you're right, I just won't. I just won't feel like this anymore. And so people then don't say it. And then everybody's kind of going, well, I'm not all right, but everybody else says they're all right, so maybe it's me. And so if at some point, fairly early on, somebody will go, you know what, sometimes you'll hear things and they will affect you because, yes, you're a trained interpreter, but above and beyond that, you're a human being.
Yeah, not just a conduit or a dictionary on legs.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So there was one terrible thought, actually, that I was just thinking about, because there are some people who say that, with remote interpreting, that it will replace, another callback to earlier episodes. But anyway, that remote is coming and will change a lot of things, but what will happen to interpreters when they really sit in their home office all day, working in these difficult situations and difficult topics, and then having not even a booth mate to debrief with or to just talk with, that could be terrible.
Yeah, I mean, likely to make the situation worse, unless you set up some kind of system whereby people can talk to each other. Because like you say, even if you're sitting next to somebody in a booth, it can be just something as simple as that, that look that goes, wow.
Yeah.
This is a lot to take. And just knowing that somebody else in that kind of instant feels the same thing.
Yeah, just getting that reaction. Yeah.
Yeah. Some kind of sign for somebody else.
I mean, I remember actually the most recent job, it wasn't a kind of deep issue, but it was, I'd just come off a technical but doable shift. And my poor booth mate started fresh on a shift with a speaker who opened her talk with 2 Robert Burns quotes. And, me being the compassionate, sympathetic person that I was, burst out laughing. But you have this shared joke in the booth of, I know you've just been given crazy shift. It's okay, we're in this together. And this is why, another one of the reasons why I've decided that I'm not offering remote interpreting and I'm not going to consult on it is because I'm not confident in the systems in place. In fact, it is my motto at the moment, is that when I started, I thought interpreting was language skills with people attached. Now I realize it's not, it's people skills with language attached.
Yeah.
And the more I think that way, the more I realize everything people say about machine interpreting is plain wrong. Everything people say about remote interpreting is just plain wrong, because we're still thinking of interpreters as invisible conduits. And until we change that record, we're going to kill ourselves, pure and simple.
Yeah, I think that probably boxes it up quite nicely.
But I mean, we've talked a lot about problems, and what I like to try to do, at least, is that as we go towards the end of an episode, is to try and find a few strategies. I think a few things that we can do, or that we can at least start and try and think about. So I know it's an unfair question to a researcher, because research very often is, observing things and studying things, not necessarily, giving tips and tricks and showing strategies or possible solutions. But is there anything that we can, what would be a good start to improve things overall?
Oh, okay. So on my wish list would be that at some point somebody changes how interpreters are trained, and that this is acknowledged, somewhere, on an individual kind of smaller solutions kind of level, it's look after yourself. It's okay to not be okay. It really is. Acknowledge that sometimes there are things that will have an impact on you, that, positive or negative. And if you can find somebody that you can talk to, it's not a breach of confidentiality. You keep the confidential details out of it.
Yeah.
But, the broader kind of thing, talk to somebody about it. Just, it is the get it off your chest. Just, it doesn't always need a counsellor. Sometimes it just needs saying out loud.
And do we maybe need to change, the codes of conduct of the professional associations?
I don't know that the codes of conduct need to change. I think...
Are we just understanding them wrong?
A more nuanced kind of approach to it.
Yeah.
Because it is or it isn't at the moment. You are invisible or you're over-involved. Well, there's a million kind of bits in between that.
Well, one of the things that I've been thinking about since I worked on the book and since I did my PhD as well was, I would love to see more people talk about the fact that as soon as you drop an interpreter into a situation, that's a different situation than one without an interpreter.
Yeah.
And especially for professionals outside of interpreting to say, actually, we don't want you to pretend you're not there. We want you to allow us to do our job with the same or better skill and appreciation and abilities as we would if this was a monolingual event. And that's very different than saying pretend you're not there. What it's saying is you're going to miss some stuff because of the language issue. What we want you to do is to do your best to make sure that we're not missing things that we would have if this was monolingual. I think that appreciation that interpreting is creative and constructive would probably help a lot to begin with, because interpreters would suddenly realise the conduit thing is a pile of garbage.
Yeah. I concur. Yeah, what he said.
Yeah. Well, we probably debunked that in episode 1, I think.
Trust me, the amount of times we hear it. I even wrote a chapter on it and got told off for writing a chapter on it, but there we go.
Yeah.
But I mean, the thing is, you can wish it to be a conduit kind of model, but you can wish it all you want. It's not going to make it so. Because it's not. Yeah, that's true.
Hallelujah.
It's kind of difficult to wrap up this kind of episode, but I found this extremely interesting and very, in a way, the most difficult episode I think we've ever done. But one of the episodes that really gave me a lot of food for thought. I don't know about you guys.
Absolutely, I totally agree.
Yeah, I'm going to be asking the people who are looking at the transition between university and the profession. On the basis of this, I'm going to be asking them that any work that's done to ease that transition includes the fact that no matter what kind of interpreting you do, you're a human being first and an interpreter second. Yeah. We probably need someone outside the profession to do the training, because I don't think the profession has the materials. But to pull someone in to sit down with people and say, this is what it's okay to do, this is what it's not okay to do, but here are exactly what you've done for us here, and saying, here are some basic all the way through to some complex techniques. For goodness sake, learn this skill set. You probably can't examine people on their, maybe you can examine them on their emotional abilities, but having something that says to them, life is going to test you on this, so we are too. And certainly off the back of this, I'm now going to talk to people who are working on that transition and saying, we have to hit this and we have to get it right. And it's probably more important than any other subject in the profession.
Especially for PSI.
Yeah, because without it, you're not going to have any. If you don't, you're going to run out.
Yeah.
We basically already have done, because 90-something% of professional PSIs in the UK are on strike still.
Okay.
Yeah, technically, yes.
Yes. And so the people who are, a large proportion of the people who are doing PSI in the UK, I don't have the exact figures, are not the same people who were doing it 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And there are all sorts of, I'm not at liberty to go into all of those issues. You'll probably get this section edited out, but that is in itself a difficult issue. We now have people doing the most dangerous form of interpreting, and they're likely to be, by and large, some of the least trained interpreters, because the good ones walked away.
Yeah.
And the other problem that leaves you with is that you have no kind of experienced interpreters to mentor the new ones to kind of go, yes, sometimes you will feel like that. Here's what I did.
Yes.
You know, so you're kind of perpetuating the problem.
Yes.
We could spend all night on that one, trust me. That would be edited out of the podcast, but yeah, we could spend all night on that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Would be more of a therapy session then.
Oh, no, but I don't know where therapy ends and ranting like a maniac begins.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a fine line.
It's a fine line. Unless
just walk it and you'll work it out.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think all I can really say now is thank you, Justine, for doing this little session with us.
Wow.
Basically.
Oh, no, thank you. It has been a blast.
Yeah.
I've got a Skype account. What's